we'd like to start out with a more general question. And I know the topic of the interview is the developments post October 7th, 2023. And it's really hard to talk about anything other than the ceasefire, because that has been the most recent and the biggest development that has happened. So, what are your opinions on this? What do you think? Uh, how cemented is the peace, and how long can it last? And also, what does it say? Given what does it say about Israel, given that it's known to also violate peace at times? What does it say about Israel and similar Western institutions that claim to uphold international law, but at the same time, are a little contradictory on that front?
Yeah, that's a big question. So regarding the ceasefire, first thing I would say is that unfortunately, I don't think it would have been accomplished without President Trump coming into power, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms, but I think that the previous administration had not been able to accomplish that, although the final ceasefire that was agreed on had already been offered in May, and the Netanyahu government just ignored it, and the Biden administration was not putting enough pressure on Israel to accept it. So I'd say that I don't think that Netanyahu would have risked doing this without massive pressure from Trump. The question is what Trump promised him, because I don't think that there was only pressure. There were also all kind of promises by Trump. We don't know exactly what they were, but I suspect they had to do with the West Bank. I suspect that Trump was saying to Netanyahu, look, we need to stop this mess in Gaza. This is costing us a lot of money. It's a distraction for me. You have to be done with it. As for the West Bank, do whatever you feel you need to do. Because very shortly after the ceasefire agreement, the Israeli army invaded Jenin, and it's now there, and it's declared that it's going to stay there. And that's part of a pattern of operating in the West Bank in ways that are similar to operations in Gaza. So it's a sort of importing tactics from Gaza to the West Bank. So that's one thing I would say, and I don't know how far that goes, but it could be that this is the beginning, having heard now the Trump administration also talking about maybe just some other countries such as Egypt and Jordan taking in Palestinians from Gaza. So this may be part of a larger discussion going on behind the scenes as to annexation of parts of the West Bank, such as Area C. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is that the ceasefire, which I hope will hold, and I hope that they'll complete phase 2 and phase 3 and actually return all the hostages and return all the prisoners that were agreed on, Palestinian prisoners, or release them. But even if that holds, and my sense is that Netanyahu is very reluctant to do that. And of course, people in his government are against it, which is why Trump now invited him to the White House, it appears to me, as additional pressure wrapped in honoring him by a visit to the White House. Even if this holds and it happens, a ceasefire is just a ceasefire. And so in the long run, nothing has changed. Everything has remained the same, only tens of thousands of people have died and vast parts of Gaza have been destroyed. But the dynamics producing violence will continue, will not go away. So it could take another year, 2 years, 5 years, and everything will happen again. So that in that sense, what is needed, and I've been talking about it now for well over a year, is a change in the political paradigm, is to understand that there must be an agreement on how these two groups, Jews and Palestinians, share this space in whichever way they find appropriate and can agree on. But if they don't agree to share the space, the violence will continue. It won't go away. And no matter how many bombs you throw on Palestinians, and no matter how many you kill, unless you actually engage in total and complete ethnic cleansing, which is part of what Trump is talking about, the problem will not go away. I don't see, however, neither the internal dynamics in Israel and among Palestinians to produce this change of paradigm, and I don't see external dynamics, certainly not from the United States or Europe, to do so. So the most realistic scenario is that even if the ceasefire holds, what we're looking at is more and more suffering and more bloodshed. And usually there's more of it. Each time it happens, more people are killed and more suffering is experienced on both sides, but obviously much more on the side of Palestinians.
Thank you for that answer. So, moving along similar lines, I also had a question regarding an article that you wrote at the early stages of the war, or at least the formal declaration of the war, which seemed to distinguish between what is happening in Gaza, whether it's a ethnic cleansing or a genocide, and you present us with an argument where you state that these are specific terms and they have meanings, and an ethnic cleansing is more so related towards taking a people out of a particular area. So given that all that has happened since then, and this is I think November 2023, given that it's been more than a year since then, do you think that you reevaluate the definition that you have given to what is happening in Palestine?
Yes, and I wrote about it. So in August 2024, I published an article in The Guardian, a long article, and what they call the long read, where I talked specifically about what I'd said in November 23 in the New York Times, where I said that there was evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but I had not been convinced yet that it was genocide, partly because genocide is a crime that's very hard to prove. And in August, so that's 9 months later, I wrote that since May, I had become increasingly convinced that what Israel was conducting in Gaza was a genocidal campaign. I should add that ethnic cleansing is not a term that exists under international law. What you have in international law as war crimes or crimes against humanity is forcible displacement. But when you say forcible displacement, that does not include the category of an ethnic group. It could be a forcible displacement just of civilians, no matter what group they belong to. So ethnic cleansing, although the term was used in the ICTY, in the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, it has not entered yet the Rome Statute and the current state of international law. Be that as it may, my view as of May was, and I've reiterated it several times, including in that Guardian article, that I'd become convinced that what Israel was carrying out, or had been carrying out now in Gaza, was a genocidal campaign, because what you could see over time was a pattern of activity that corresponded to the kind of statements that had been made by Israeli leaders in October. The statements themselves were often genocidal in content. But one at the time could say that they were made at the heat of the moment and that they were not necessarily guidelines, although they clearly could be seen as incitement to soldiers. But over time, and I think in May, with the entry of the IDF into Rafah and the removal of 1 million Palestinians who had already been displaced several times from the Rafah area to the Mawasi, to the beach area, where there's no infrastructure whatsoever, and then the destruction of Rafah. At that point, it appeared that there had always been a pattern of destruction, which was destruction of housing, but also destruction of universities, of hospitals, of schools, of mosques, of museums, of anything that makes for the cultural and educational existence of a group, and thereby making Gaza uninhabitable, and the recreation of a Palestinian culture in Gaza increasingly difficult. And that was the goal of that operation, that is to destroy that group as such. Now, if you think about ethnic cleansing, which is a term that was used by a former Minister of Defense and Chief of Staff, Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, in December, this last December, he was saying that what the IDF was doing in northern Gaza, north of the Netzarim corridor, was ethnic cleansing. Sorry. The problem with ethnic cleansing is not only that it's not well defined in international law, but also that if you speak of ethnic cleansing, what you're saying is moving a particular ethnic group from an area that you want for your own ethnic group to some other area. But what happened in Gaza was that people were moved from one area to another, but they were constantly under attack wherever they were moved to. So in that sense, this is not ethnic cleansing. This is displacement to so-called safe areas that were then attacked. There was no real safe area at all. And they were not moved to the Sinai Peninsula or to Egypt because the borders were closed and sealed. And in that sense, ethnic cleansing is a misnomer, and it sort of indicates the reluctance to identify what is actually going on, even if you agree that the policy is one of removing the Palestinians from areas that Israel wants to take over. Now, all of this right now is on hold, right? And in fact, in the last few days, as you know, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have moved back into northern Gaza. But they have nothing there. Everything has been destroyed. And it's not just housing, it's the infrastructure. There's no water, there's nothing works there. And where this will go is still completely unclear. So in that sense, the Israeli operation has been a total failure. It has not removed the Hamas leadership. We see that Hamas is operating on the ground. In fact, Israel has ensured that Hamas will stay in control, which is the greatest irony of the whole thing, because the goal of the operation was to release the hostages and destroy Hamas. The hostages are now being returned only by agreement with Hamas, under the control of Hamas. And Israel, because the policy of the government is not to let anybody else take over, which would be the Palestinian Authority, by default, the only people who can keep order, and that Israel is saying should keep order, is Hamas. They say there was chaos now in the release of the last group of hostages. They say Hamas should take care that there won't be such chaos next time they return the hostages. So they're basically putting Hamas back in control of Gaza. So all that was accomplished was the killing of tens of thousands of people, the destruction of Gaza, and we're back at point zero.
Yeah, Professor, recently after Trump took power, he issued an executive order that states that all citizens, all non-citizens who show support for Palestine should be deported. And there has also been a rise of neo-Nazis and alt-right groups that support genuine anti-Semitism. And yet the response against that has been arguably less extreme. We would like to know what are your thoughts on this duality that has been expressed by the United States in managing the pro-Palestinian movement with a heavy crackdown on college encampments and other similar demonstrations.
Yeah, thank you. So until this last executive order by Trump, or until basically Trump became president again, what we saw happening on American campuses was extremely troubling, because what you had was groups of students, quite a few of them Jewish students, who were protesting against what they saw was happening in Gaza. They were, first of all, just appalled by what they saw, and that's what you would expect from people who are watching the news. And they wanted to express their disgust and anger at what they were seeing. They were also protesting as American citizens, and as American citizens, they are taxpayers, and the United States was funding, to the tune of $20 billion, the constant destruction of Gaza, with an enormous supply of arms, munitions, bombs, rockets, artillery shells, and so forth to Israel on a daily basis, and was giving Israel political cover. So the protests, and I visited a number of them, there were some marginal voices on the side that could be described as anti-Semitic. There were some who were not particularly pleasant, but the vast majority of them was not about that at all. However, they were described as such, and they were described as such by various Republican representatives, by right-wing media, and most importantly, by donors to universities, by the corporations or boards that support these universities, and eventually by university presidents and other members of university administrations, to the extent that in the name of combating anti-Semitism, these protests were basically stopped with police intervention, very brutal police intervention. If you call in the NYPD or the LAPD, these are not people who you want to mess around with. And there was a fair amount of violence by the police against students in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. So to my mind, first of all, this use or misuse of anti-Semitism, this attribution of anti-Semitism to people who say things you don't like, is dangerous. It's dangerous also because it's not only about Israel and Palestine. It can be about anything. It is an attempt, and that started before Trump came into power, by the American right, with the cooperation of various liberal university administrations, to shut down free speech. And it could be about Gaza, but it could be about other issues, and there will be many other issues in the coming years. So this is, first of all, dangerous. It's also dangerous because the people who were doing that, the people who were putting pressure, especially on university administrations, to stop these demonstrations, were often donors. These donors were often Jewish. Billionaire donors. Now, they claim to be representatives of the Jewish community. They're not representatives of the Jewish community. They're representatives of their own money and of their own power, and they're drunk on their power. But the problem is that what they're doing is they are providing ammunition for real anti-Semites. And my fear is that this use of anti-Semitism as a tool to control speech will actually produce real anti-Semitism. And that refers to your second question, because many of the people who, or the second part of your question, many we don't know exactly how many, but clearly among Trump supporters, among the people who were supporting his return to power, were the same types who we saw in Charlottesville demonstrating at the time, saying Jews will not replace us. There is an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, which is combined with Islamophobia, with anti-immigrant notions, and the idea of the great replacement theory, that behind all those things that are happening to us, which are bad, such as foreigners coming in, not only white people in our community, but people of different colors and different religions, that behind all that are the Jews. Because the Jews are trying to undermine white Christian society. That's an old anti-Semitic trope. And this, unfortunately, may well be an undercurrent now of the current administration, which is a white supremacist at its core. It's a white supremacist movement. That's what the MAGA movement is. Obviously, there are many people who voted for Trump who are not part of that, but at its core, it is that. So this last executive order is obviously extremely troubling because it plays on both these elements. One element being we want to shut down speech, and therefore anybody who supports Palestinians should be removed, and if they're not American citizens, they should be kicked out. But it will eventually apply to American citizens as well, and it does already at universities. You saw what happened at Harvard right now when they closed down a conference, when they adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is a really bad definition. So it's happening well beyond groups that are not American citizens. It's happening in the heartland, in the sort of cores of elite American institutions. And if it happens there, then obviously it can happen in small towns around America. But also at the same time, there is an anti-Semitic, a real anti-Semitic undercurrent to this kind of sentiment against foreigners. And if you combine the two, the danger is that they start justifying each other and they gain their own momentum. And this is something that may be happening in front of our eyes right now. And I know that there is a fair amount of intimidation and fear on American campuses now among colleagues who are afraid to speak out. And they may not be like me. I'm about to retire, so I don't care. I say whatever I think, but there are people who I think are scared, and I can understand why. And that's a very dangerous process, because if to boil it down to one thing, it's a kind of new McCarthyism. And McCarthyism that is using a false attribution of anti-Semitism to justify itself as something good, just like McCarthyism was anti-communist and hypothetically in favor of democracy, while in fact it was doing exactly the opposite.
Thank you so much for that answer. What you just said about the censorship of Palestinian voices, pro-Palestinian voices across campuses, and the, poisoning of our public discourse also makes me realize the fact that there seems to be a general lack of collective social conscience or even plain empathy among Israeli citizens, like a lot of Israeli citizens. And I think this was something you also pointed out in one of your articles when you said that, this was one of the two reigning sentiments in today's Israeli society. And I quote, in 1982, hundreds of thousands of Israelis protested against the massacre of Palestinian population in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in western Beirut by Maronite Christian militias facilitated by the IDF. However, you point out how today this kind of response might be inconceivable. So, what do you think is the reason for this shift? And what do you think is the reason of this absence of absolute empathy for Palestinians?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, even in August 2023, some colleagues of mine and myself issued the statement or petition that we call the elephant in the room, saying that all those people, hundreds of thousands of Israelis who were protesting against the Israeli government's judicial coup, were refusing, the vast majority of them, to speak about the elephant in the room, which was the occupation. And I think this is at the core of what we're seeing now. So maybe I'd say two things. First of all, Israeli politics since 1982, and certainly since 2000, has taken a very strong shift to the right. And in fact, there is no left wing in Israel anymore. Everything has moved to the right. The right has become more extreme, and the left has become more center and right. That means that the vast majority of Israelis bought the argument until October 7th that the occupation can be managed, meaning we don't have to think about it. Well, we built a wall around Palestinians, bypass roads, and they don't really exist. They underwent what is being called by sociologists social death. They don't exist for us. The only encounter with Palestinians is either, say, as construction workers, and then they're transparent, or when you go there as a soldier, and then you break into their homes, beat them up, show them who's boss. Otherwise, they don't exist. That means, and that's the second thing, that the occupation has created a long-term process of dehumanization, of not thinking of Palestinians as fellow human beings, not thinking of Palestinians as people who have rights to have rights, who deserve any rights, who deserve any protection. Now, all of that was at work before October 7th. But October 7th, of course, was also an event that was extremely shocking to large numbers of Israelis, quite traumatic. There are many, many, many Israelis who were directly affected by the massacre of 800-900 civilians, including my own family. And the sense, the deep sense of insecurity that still exists in the country, the lack of trust in the government, the sense that the army screwed up big time. And so all of this, I'd say, played into pre-existing sentiments about Palestinians. Now, not only do you think of them as, not really as human as we are, you also think of them as savages, as dangerous, as people who just have to be wiped out. And large numbers of Israelis, even including those who were demonstrating against the government before and after October 7th, were demonstrating for other reasons. They were demonstrating because they wanted the return of the hostages. They thought maybe Netanyahu should go as a prime minister, but they were not demonstrating about what they and their sons and daughters and grandchildren were actually doing in their name in Gaza. And it's become very difficult. And, I wrote about my visit to Israel in June, and then I was there again in December. And in December, I could see that more people knew what had happened in Gaza. So they had more information, but it didn't change their attitude. They were still quite indifferent to that, saying, well, they had it coming. They deserved it. If they come and slaughter our children, we should wipe them out. That's a very, very troubling aspect of what has happened in Israeli society. And, people have asked me that, do I think that Israel will come to terms at some point with what it did in Gaza? And I don't think that will happen unless there is an actual change of politics. That is, unless there is a beginning of a process of reconciliation with Palestinians. At least if you look at historical precedents, that's the only moment at which a group that was collectively responsible for such vast destruction can begin to look at what it had done in a critical manner. That's what happened in Germany, of course, but it took decades for that to happen there. It's never really happened in America, let's say, vis-a-vis Vietnam. It's the French have never quite faced up to what they did in Nigeria and so forth. It's a very long process. But as long as it doesn't happen, that has a very deep distorting effect on societies. If they don't face up to their past, that past keeps coming back. And I'm afraid that what happened in Gaza was so horrific that its long-term effects, even if it's over, will be devastating, obviously for Palestinians, there's no question about that, but also for Jewish Israeli society, and will be part of a process of growing authoritarian rule, more internal violence, and the disappearance of any remnants of liberal democratic society there.
Thank you very much for that answer, Professor. Your point about how the past will keep haunting Israeli society, as long as they don't sort of reconcile with this, it also made me think about how, the memory of Holocaust is very frequently evoked by those in power, especially Netanyahu. So, for instance, in the past, Netanyahu has claimed, that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin Ali Husseini, was one of the main voices that persuaded Hitler and the Nazis to carry a genocide against the Jews, a claim that was later criticized by many. Do you think that this could be considered an instance of Holocaust revisionism? Netanyahu has constantly used the Holocaust to point to the history of oppression of the Jewish people. What do you think would be the long-term implications of such revisions, both in and outside Israel?
Yeah, it's also a good question. Look, first of all, this argument that was made by Netanyahu about Husseini is just, a bunch of propaganda. I mean, Hitler didn't need Husseini to become anti-Semitic or to have genocidal fantasies and then policies against the Jews. And that's a typical sort of Netanyahu trick. I'm actually thinking of next year of convening a workshop to talk about the question of the future of genocide and Holocaust studies after the Holocaust. After Gaza. Because I think that what we saw now, although the trends were there before, but what we saw much more clearly since October 7th is the way in which the Holocaust has been instrumentalized both to justify massive violence and destruction on an unprecedented scale and to shut down criticism of it. And what effect that would have on studying and commemorating the Holocaust, which is an event that should be studied and should be commemorated. And what effect will that have on the study of genocide? And what effect will that have on the rule of international law, which came into force in large part in the aftermath of the Holocaust, in the aftermath of the destruction of European Jewry and then of the Nazi regime. So these are very big questions. I don't know that we can say for sure where this will go. I think that it's likely that in terms of studying the Holocaust, teaching courses, commemorating the Holocaust, there would be two potential paths. One would be for people to close in on themselves. So, because Jewish communities will continue commemorating the Holocaust as a family memory, it's something that is deep in collective memory and in personal family memories, but that it will become a sort of ethnocentric pursuit as it was at the beginning, because for many years that's the way it was. And that will mean that if you teach a course on the Holocaust, there will be far fewer students, and there'll be sort of heritage students, which is a really, I think, not a positive prospect. The second would be to develop studying and teaching and commemorating the Holocaust as part of a larger context of genocide and other crimes against humanity in the 20th century and now 21st century. So to engage in that as part of an attempt to understand and also to prevent in law as well as in study and politics the recurrence of genocidal events. So to take it out of the ethnic sort of traditional focus and to expand it, as quite a number of Holocaust survivors had always said should be done. Which way we'll go, I don't know, because there is, I think, a great deal of cynicism now about the Holocaust. People saying, this is an opening to one of these dark phenomena of Holocaust denial, right? To say, well, the Holocaust, whatever happened then, it's just used to justify Israeli violence. Well, it is, but that's not what the Holocaust was about. And there are other reasons to study the Holocaust as an event. So this kind of cynicism is alive and kicking. I can tell you one thing. Look, I teach right now a class on modern genocide and other crimes against humanity. There are many people in that class. I told them that we are obviously going to study many genocides, including the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. And I added a week to that class, which is about Gaza. And I think that we should try to understand and to study all of those. There is often an argument that comes from people who may be very rational and well-informed, saying, well, what happened in Gaza is not the Holocaust, which of course is true. There were no shooting pits, there were no gas chambers, but none of that existed also in Rwanda or in Bosnia or in Kampuchea or in German Southwest Africa or in Ottoman Turkey with the killing of the Armenians. So there can be a genocide that does not look like the Holocaust. The Holocaust had its own unique features, but it was a genocide, and there were many others. And so there's this resistance to speak about the Holocaust as part of a more generic phenomenon of genocide. And the way I teach genocide is that, yes, each of these events had its own unique features, but they're also part of a larger attempt or particular type of attempt to destroy a group. And unfortunately and tragically, I have to say, I find it deeply tragic that 80 years after the end of World War II, the state that was created in the aftermath of the Holocaust and was supposed to at least presented itself as the answer to the Holocaust, engaged in this kind of genocidal war, using that past event to justify it rather than using it to stop itself from acting in this way. That's a tragedy. It's the cunning of history, if you want, and that has to be said, however painful it is.
Thank you, Professor. Moving on, we've seen that you have done a decent amount of work on cinema and Jewish representation in Nazi cinema. In the past year or so, there has been a rise in the popularity of films on and by Palestinians. And one thing that is different between now and the Second World War is that the Jewish people during the Holocaust did not have the opportunity to document their suffering during the process. The Palestinians, however, in that sense, have been fairly successful in documenting their own conditions themselves. How do you look at this difference? And do you think that the role of cinema in shaping domestic and international opinions is different now than it was 70 years ago?
I think, just to speak about the present moment, I think what shapes public opinion more than cinema these days is social media. Social media obviously uses a lot of cinematic, if you like, just using videos, and that has had a very large effect. The problem is that no one is really controlling it. It can go all ways. Everybody's using it, and in that sense, cinema, when you make a film, it's a major investment, and you have to work with people who will fund it, who will distribute it. When you are just using your phone, if you're an Israeli soldier in Gaza, or you are a Palestinian there, or if you're in the West Bank, or wherever you might be, you can immediately post it online, and within minutes it could be broadcast by CNN, or usually not by CNN, but it could be, or by Al Jazeera, or whoever. And then the filtering process is very different. So it has been said, that what happened in Gaza was the first genocide that was broadcast live. I'm a bit skeptical about that. I don't know that it was broadcast live. There was a lot of material coming out, but is that the same? It's not the same as had there been larger numbers of reporters on the ground providing information, because you can't really know who is doing what. And we know that social media creates its own bubbles, creates its own fake videos. It's very hard to sift through them. I can say I was just meeting a journalist from Haaretz the day before yesterday, and he was involved, from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and he was involved in a project that they worked on for about a month of documenting very carefully what the IDF had been doing in northern Gaza in the months, in the early summer months. And they used aerial photography, they used social media posts, they used other type of photographs coming out from there, but they subjected it all to very careful analysis, locating it, making sure that what they were using was not fake itself. And the subsequent report was a very important report on the extent of destruction in northern Gaza and the plans that were there that now have been thwarted to use that then for settlement, to entirely flatten it, remove the population, and then move in Jewish settlers. For now, temporarily at least, that has been thwarted. So I don't know whether this kind of social media reporting, what effect it is having. We know that mainstream media reporting from Gaza has been totally lamentable. Partly because the Israeli army would not let them in, partly because it was very, very dangerous to report from there, and numerous Al Jazeera reporters were killed, and some of them at least clearly were shot intentionally by the IDF. As for film, look, I mean, cinema has changed. It's not the same thing as it was. I'll give you one example that occurred to me when I was in Israel just now in December. This was very interesting to me. A few months ago, this film, Zone of Interest, came out, right? I don't know if you saw it. That's the film that is based on on a novel that is about Husserl's home right next to Auschwitz, right? And I was sitting with people in Israel and talking with them about what's going on in Gaza, although most of them didn't want to talk about it. But those who were, and they said it reminded them of zone of interest. So people were making these analogies in their minds that because you can sit in a cafe in Tel Aviv having a nice drink, and 50 miles south from there is mass killing going on. And they were making that analogy. So in that sense, a film of that sort, which the filmmaker himself said was not really about Auschwitz. He sort of said it also to make a political statement, of course. Has it the kind of analogical impact that a good piece of art, whether it's a poem or a film or a novel, can have. But in terms of actual information, I think it was social media, and information by social media is problematic by its very nature, because it's not filtered, it's not vetted, and we just don't know what we're getting. It's shocking. It can be shocking, but we have very few tools to contextualize it, at least at the time that it's happening. And so you need a perspective of time, and then it's no longer live. If you've taken all that time, then you're not talking anymore about live reporting.
Thank you, Professor, for that answer. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, but just one, because I really have to go in at the most 10 minutes.
All right. We'll keep it short. But so the next question that we wanted to ask was regarding the recognition of the Palestinian state. And recently, I think a few months ago, Ireland became, one of the only countries to shut down the Israeli embassy and turn it into a museum. Similarly, we're speaking from India. India also recognized Palestine in the 70s, the first non-Arab country to recognize Palestine. So do you think that given all that has happened, in the future, can we expect more countries to make the formal recognition, or at least the first step, of formal recognition of saying that, Palestine is a state of its own? And what are the, what are the perspectives that the Western countries will have of this newer state if it were to emerge?
Look, I mean, it was very moving to hear Irish politicians speaking about Palestine, recognizing Palestine, and speaking about that through the perspective of Irish history. But I have to say, I don't think that recognition of a Palestinian state does much. Because in practice there is no Palestinian state, and the problem is to have a Palestinian state. Recognizing it is generally a pretty cheap thing to do. It doesn't cost you much, unless you encounter the ire of the White House, right? I mean, so the price may be that kind of price, but otherwise, so it's a gesture, but I don't think it's terribly meaningful. What I do think may happen, which will change things in terms of Israel's position in the international community, and Israel is a state that is recognized and has a government, and has all the attributes of a real state, which was the accomplishment of Zionism. That's what it succeeded in doing. And when you have that, it's very hard to take it away from you. Israeli policy right now, if it continues in this direction, possibly with the help of the United States, may create an increasingly pariah state. Because if what I suspect may happen is larger annexations, there was a map circulating yesterday of a proposal by Trump. Again, I'm actually not sure it's true or not because it's social media, so I'm skeptical. But if Israel is allowed to annex more territories, it will become not only a de facto apartheid state, and there is an apartheid regime in the West Bank right now, in everything but name. It will become a de jure apartheid state, because if it annexes territory with large numbers of Palestinians in it, it will not give them citizenship, and they will be not even under the facade of an occupation, which has been ruled, as you know, by the ICJ illegal and has to immediately stop. Of course, it didn't. That will create a process, I think, of gradual distancing between Israel and even its closest allies, and between Israel and Jewish communities around the world. It will become increasingly embarrassing to be associated with a state that is an apartheid state. It will also generate more and more internal violence and turmoil. So all the attributes of democracy will also disappear. And so Israel will no longer be able to present itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, as having the most moral army in the world, and all that stuff. That will erode its standing, and in the long run, but I'm talking about, it could be a very long run, it could take a couple of decades, will bring about a situation that the state as such will implode. In that sense, you can make the analogy with South Africa. If you become increasingly isolated, however much power you can exert on the people under your control, you are constantly becoming weaker, economically, internationally, in your socially, in terms of your own social solidarity, everything that the state needs to survive. That will obviously have a meaning as to the fate of Palestinians, because we have to remember that since 1967, Israel is in control of a similar number of Jews and Palestinians. By now, you have 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians who are under the control of the Israeli government in one form or another. And all Palestinians, including those who are Israeli citizens, have limited rights or no rights at all. So it will be at that point that there will be meaning to other countries to help Israel and Palestinians to form a different sort of regime. But to my mind, this kind of recognition of a state that isn't there is a little bit of a cheap political exercise.